you so much for joining us today for Judaism and Anti-Intellectualism with Dr. Elias Sacks. I also want to thank our great partners in Denver, Temple Emmanuel, for co-sponsoring today's event. And I would love to tell you a little bit about our guest speaker today. Elias Sacks is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he studies Jewish thought, philosophy of religion, Jewish-Christian relations, religious ethics, and religion and politics. He is the author of Moses Mendelssohn's living script, Philosophy, Practice, History, Judaism, as well as articles on medieval and modern thinkers, including Mendelssohn, Moses Maimonides, Baruch Spinoza, Nachman Krochmal, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, Hermann Cohen, Franz Rosenzweig, and Jacob Tobes. Previously, Sacks served as director of the Jewish Publications Society. And I can also share in a moment in the chat some links to previous classes that Dr. Sacks has taught with us, as well as another class that we have coming up in January. Dr. Sacks, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Alex, for those words of welcome. Thank you to the Valley Beit Midrash for inviting me here. Thank you for Temple Emmanuel for co-sponsoring and hosting this event. And most importantly, thank you to all of you for being here. I'm excited to learn and think together. So our topic today is Judaism and Anti-Intellectualism. I'll share our screen so we can look at a little bit about this topic together. Our topic is Judaism and Anti-Intellectualism. And I suggested this topic because in many ways, we live in an anti-intellectual age, a time of skepticism and hostility regarding the sorts of individuals we often describe as intellectuals and the sorts of activities those individuals pursue, right? This is a time of skepticism and hostility regarding forms of knowledge or inquiry or learning that claim to offer some sort of specialized, rigorous, non-intuitive, non-obvious knowledge of the world, right? So think of the natural sciences, right? They paint a picture of how the world works that's very different from what we encounter in ordinary life, right? We don't see quantum particles and human evolution and viruses in our daily experience, but the natural sciences tell us that those concepts are the best way to explain what's going on, right? Think of medicine, right, which claims to diagnose the causes of ailments that seem mysterious to us, which prescribes modes of treatment relying on biochemical expertise, empirical studies, and other forms of knowledge to which most of us don't have access. Right? Think of a field such as philosophy, right, which explores many of the concepts we use in our daily life: freedom, good, evil, cause and effect, time, which claims to do so in particularly rigorous ways and to yield surprising and even counterintuitive conclusions. Think of higher education as a sector. Think of higher education as a whole, which claims to prepare students for the workforce, for citizenship, for life, through classes that involve ideas that are often very different from what students may have encountered in their high schools, homes, and communities. What these sorts of pursuits have in common is that they claim to offer some sort of specialized, rigorous, non-intuitive knowledge about the world. And what these pursuits also have in common is that they're increasingly objects of skepticism and hostility, especially in the United States. All right, so take the natural sciences. In a 2023 survey, 57% of Americans said that science has had a mostly positive effect on society. That might not sound bad, but that share is down 8 percentage points since November 2021 and a full 16 points since before the start of COVID. Right? Take higher education as another example. In a poll from just this past July, Americans were nearly equally divided among those who view higher education with a great deal or quite a lot of confidence, with some confidence, or with little or no confidence. Right? 36% had a great deal of confidence, 32% had some confidence, and 32% also had little or no confidence, right? And this is a dramatic change from the first time Gallup asked this question in 2015, when a whopping 57% of Americans viewed higher ed with a great degree of confidence. Right, so there's more that we could say about all of these trends. For example, about how they kind of exist across partisan divides, or also about these causes, right? These trends reflect genuine responses to the claims made by these fields. They reflect the actions of political actors, both good and bad faith, And they reflect the behavior of many intellectuals themselves, right? My own field of higher ed has not exactly covered itself in glory over the past year or so. Today, though, I want to explore a different question. How might we respond? How might we address this rising tide of anti-intellectualism? For those of us who feel that for all of their flaws, the sciences are crucial to addressing challenges such as climate change and preventing future pandemics. For those of us who feel that for all of its flaws, higher education can still be a vehicle for forming well-rounded future citizens, what should we do? And in particular, how might the Jewish tradition help us respond to these challenges? But anti-intellectualism is not an exclusively modern development. On the contrary, it has a long history and traditions, including Judaism, where many figures have opposed science, philosophy, and other forms of rigorous intellectual inquiry as irrelevant at best and dangerous at worst. So how can we learn then from Jewish responses to Jewish anti-intellectualism? How have Jews sought to defend or create space for philosophical and scientific studies? And what might those approaches teach us today? So I thought we could think about this question in three stages. First, I'll say something very briefly about this idea of Jewish anti-intellectualism. Second, I'm going to look at two Jewish thinkers who wrestled with versions of this phenomenon. A medieval Jewish thinker named Moses Maimonides, and a modern Eastern European Jewish philosopher named Nachman Krochmal. And then I'll conclude by very briefly reflecting on what all this means for us today. Does this seem reasonable for everyone? Okay, excellent. So, Jewish anti-intellectualism. Now, often when I raise this topic, people respond with something between confusion and anger. What could I possibly have in mind when I refer to Jewish anti-intellectualism? They ask. Isn't Judaism a tradition that has valorized education? Aren't Jews the people of the book? Aren't there many, many, many Jewish Nobel Prize winners? So there's substance behind these reactions, but it's important to recognize that these reactions don't tell the whole story. Excuse me. And in particular, as I just mentioned, there's actually a long history of Jewish thinkers opposing science, philosophy, and other forms of intellectual inquiry. Rabbinic literature, for example, contains a number of traditions about what it calls Greek wisdom. So look at one example on your screen. This is from the Babylonian Talmud. The rabbi said at that time, "Cursed is the person who raises pigs, and cursed is the person who teaches his son Greek wisdom." Now, it's not at all clear what this meant in its original context. However, regardless of what this text originally meant, it's interpreted by many later Jewish figures as a prohibition on the sort of wisdom commonly associated with the ancient Greeks, as a prohibition on Jews engaging the traditions of science and philosophy associated with ancient Greek figures such as Aristotle. There are also sources where individual Jews report the opposition that they encountered to their own pursuits of philosophical and scientific studies. So consider this next passage, which is from the writings of Jacob Anatoli, who's a 13th century rabbi from southern France. He writes, "One of the rabbis of my generation reproached me a number of times for occasionally studying in Arabic bits of Chokhmah Limudit, preparatory sciences. I answered him by the same token, do not treat my study as you would treat someone taking a walk or playing the dice." So that reference to studying the preparatory sciences in Arabic is a reference to studying mathematics and perhaps physical sciences in Arabic works influenced by Greek thoughts. And Anatoly is recording in turn opposition to such study. On his telling, one rabbi responded to his pursuits of science and philosophy with criticism and mockery. This rabbi compared science and philosophy to playing the dice, to an activity that's at best irrelevant, right? A kind of recreational pursuit with little Jewish import. And that is at worst dangerous, right? A quasi-immoral distraction from how Jews should be spending their time. For all the stories about Jews valuing education and winning Nobel Prizes, then, that's not the whole picture. There's a long tradition of Jewish skepticism and hostility towards science and philosophy. What I want to consider is how Jewish thinkers have responded. And so I thought we could begin with one of the most influential Jewish thinkers of the past 1,000 years, Moses Maimonides, also known as Rambam. So he's born in 1138, dies in around 1204. He's born in Spain, but he spends most of his life in North Africa, and in particular in Cairo, where he's the physician to that city's Islamic ruler. So Maimonides was many things. He was a legal authority. He composed a Hebrew work called the Mishneh Torah, which is really the first comprehensive code of halakha or Jewish law. He was also a philosopher. He composed an Arabic work called The Guide of the Perplexed, which explores the relationship between the Jewish tradition on the one hand and the science and philosophy, associated with the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle on the other. And it was many other things as well. So the first important point for us about Maimonides is that he was a firm believer in the importance of philosophy and science for Jewish life. For many Jews and non-Jews of Maimonides' time, when they talked about science and philosophy, what they had in mind in particular was science and philosophy deriving from the work of that ancient Greek philosopher I just mentioned, Aristotle. So in the Middle Ages, Aristotle was a sort of Einstein or Darwin-like figure. Although he lived in Greece kind of some 1,500 years before Maimonides, before the Middle Ages, he was widely seen as having developed the most compelling scientific and philosophical framework for making sense of the world, right? This framework was not taken to be without flaws. It wasn't taken to be perfect, but it was nevertheless perceived as providing a largely compelling account of how the cosmos works. And although Maimonides had all sorts of critiques of Aristotle and Aristotelian thoughts, he would also wholeheartedly endorse the importance of that framework. So, for example, in a letter to another Jew, Maimonides wrote that his opinion, I mean to say the opinion of Aristotle, is the ultimate human opinion, save for those who receive divine emanation so that they attain the rank of the prophets. Aristotle is right below the prophets. Studying Aristotle, studying Aristotelian science and philosophy is studying the ultimate human opinion, the ultimate best form of human thought. And the roots of this Maimonidean embrace of philosophy and science, and in particular of Aristotelian philosophy and Aristotelian science, can be understood as lying in Maimonides' view of what it means to be a human being. So for Maimonides, the ultimate goal of human existence is intellectual perfection, intellectual excellence. This is what Maimonides writes in The Guide of the Perplexed. The truly human attainment is winning the intellectual virtues, the conceptual thinking that yields sound views of divinity. This is our highest goal, and what makes a human human. So for Maimonides, our highest goal should be winning the intellectual virtues. The conceptual thinking that yields sound views of divinity. Our highest goal should be perfecting our intellect, trying to understand as much as we can, especially about God. After all, Maimonides says this is what makes a human human. Intellectual perfection is the only kind of excellence, the only kind of attainment that's unique to human beings. It's what makes us different from animals. And this is part of why Maimonides embraces science and philosophy. If what it means to be a human being is to try to know as much as we can about the cosmos and God, and if science and philosophy can help us gain knowledge about that cosmos and about that God, then science and philosophy are crucial to what it means to be a human being. Science and philosophy help us pursue the highest form of attainment available to humanity. So, for example, Maimonides thinks that astronomy helps us grasp God's existence. According to Aristotelian science, the cosmos is structured as a series of concentric spheres in which stars and planets are embedded. You have Earth at the center, and then a sphere in which the moon is embedded, followed by other spheres containing Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the rest of the stars, as well as one sphere behind all of these. And when we see the moon and the sun and the planets and the stars moving in the sky, what we're seeing is those spheres turn. The sun appears to move across the sky because the sphere in which it's embedded is moving. The planets appear to move across the sky because the spheres in which they're embedded are moving, and so on and so forth. And this astronomical model, Maimonides says, helps us know God. If all of the spheres are moving, there must be some ultimate source of that motion. There must be a cause of all there is. There must be a God. Rational scientific reflection points to God's existence. Moreover, Maimonides says, this sort of rational, scientific, philosophical reflection leads to conclusions actually about God, or at least about what God is not. So, for example, according to Maimonides, this sort of rational reflection should lead us to conclude that God does not exhibit any emotions. To have emotions is to be under the sway of others. To have emotions is to have something make me happy, or make me sad, or make me angry. But surely, Maimonides reasons, God is not under the sway of others. God is omnipotent, all powerful. No one can make God do anything. Surely no one can make God happy. No one can make God sad. No one can make God angry. God must be above all emotions. God isn't going to surrender the kind of control we surrender when we feel emotions. Similarly, to have emotions is to change. It's to have something and become happy in response, or become sad in response, or become angry in response. To have emotions is to change. But surely, Maimonides reasons, God doesn't change. God is perfect, and if God is perfect, why would God change? If you're the best you can be, why would you change to be anything else? And so again, Maimonides concludes God must be above emotions. If emotions involve change, and if God doesn't change, God must not have emotions. So these are just some of the examples of how Maimonides thought that science and philosophy could help us grasp God and the cosmos. There are many others as well. The important point here, right, the first point to have in mind about Maimonides is that he's a firm believer in the importance of philosophy and science for a Jewish life. He thought that the purpose of human existence was to pursue intellectual perfection, and he saw science and philosophy as crucial means of doing so. The second point to have in mind about Maimonides is that he was aware that this embrace of philosophy and science could inspire opposition. So he knew texts like that passage from the Talmud attacking Greek wisdom. And he was also aware that science and philosophy could be experienced, could be perceived as dangerous to Jewish life. Look at how he describes the purpose of his guide of the perplexed, his work on the relationship between philosophy and science in Judaism. The specific purpose here, the specific purpose of this book, is to arouse intellectually a religious, morally, and spiritually mature person who is settled of mind and committed to the Torah's truth, who studied and absorbed the philosophical sciences. That sort of person is troubled by the surface sense of certain biblical expressions. Resisting what he still takes or was taught as the meaning of its words, he hangs back, perplexed and confused. Should he follow his reason, reject what he took those words to say, and presume that he has shed core biblical precepts? Or should he hold fast to what he took those words to mean and fight reason's sway, dig in his heels and resist, feeling injured by reason, as though it has sullied his faith and retained his fanciful beliefs? So Maimonides envisions a reader who's studied and absorbed the philosophical sciences and who's troubled by the surface sense of certain biblical expressions. Right? The idea here is that someone who has studied philosophy will reject the straightforward meaning of certain core Jewish terms and concepts and attain a more sophisticated, deeper understanding of those terms and of those concepts, right? So to use one of the examples I just offered, someone who studies philosophy will come to conclude that God is above emotion. And that person will therefore reject the straightforward literal sense of the numerous biblical passages that ascribe emotions to God, that cast God as happy or sad or angry or loving, right? This individual will come to see all of those biblical phrases as metaphors, as vivid language that's not literally true, right? God is not actually the emotional being of the Bible, but something very different, unchanging, emotionless, unaffected by the world. At the same time, Maimonides continues, it's entirely understandable that some individuals might recoil from this kind of philosophically inspired activity. He envisions an individual responding to philosophical inquiry by fighting reason's sway, resisting feeling injured by reason as though it has sullied his faith, and retaining his fanciful beliefs. Maimonides acknowledges that this rational, philosophical, scientific reflection might seem injurious. It might seem harmful. It might seem like something that sullies faith. Right? If philosophy suggests that God is an unchanging, emotionless being, doesn't that strike at the heart of Jewish belief? Doesn't that mean that God doesn't care about the world? That God doesn't love the Jewish people? Isn't philosophy therefore something to be resisted? Shouldn't we fight reason's sway? Maimonides, in other words, recognizes that anti-intellectualism is a live and real possibility. He recognizes that despite his embrace of philosophy and science, those forms of knowledge might be perceived as harmful, as undermining core tenets of Jewish life. And so he'll need some way to address this, right? Some way to secure a space for philosophy in Judaism. Okay, so how does he do this? Well, he has many strategies, from offering a comprehensive reinterpretation of biblical concepts to adopting a careful form of writing designed to conceal some of his most radical conclusions. In the time we have, though, I want to highlight just two of the strategies he employs. He re-narrates Jewish history, and he reimagines Jewish practice. So let's begin with the former. Simply put, Maimonides re-narrates the Jewish past. He retells Jewish history in a way which suggests that science and philosophy have always been part of Jewish life. So we'll look in a moment, for example, at his Mishnah Torah, at his comprehensive law code. In that code, Maimonides discusses one of the Bible's best-known figures, Abraham, right? The individual often remembered as the founder of the Jewish people and of Judaism, right? Someone who entered into a special relationship or covenant with God. As I suspect some of you may know, in the Bible, God repeatedly appears to Abraham, speaks with Abraham, and gives Abraham all sorts of instructions and promises. Instructions to move to the land of Israel, to circumcise his male descendants, promises about future rewards. By contrast, look at what Maimonides writes about this figure. After Abraham was weaned, while still an infant, his mind began to reflect. By day and by night, he was thinking and wondering, how is it possible that the celestial sphere turns round? His mind was busily working until he'd attained the way of truth, apprehended the correct line of thoughts, and knew that there is one God, that he guides the celestial sphere and created everything. Abraham was 40 years old when he recognized his creator. Having attained this knowledge, he began to refute the inhabitants of the land in which he was living, saying to them, the course you are following is not the way of truth. He broke the idolatrous images common in that land. So Maimonides gives no indication that Abraham ever spoke with God or received instructions from God or received promises from God. Rather, Maimonides tells a very, very different story. First, Maimonides presents Abraham as an astronomer and a philosopher. Abraham looked up at the heavens, saw that there were celestial spheres in motion, and reasoned that there must be a God behind that motion. Abraham, in other words, engaged in precisely, the sort of philosophical or scientific reflection that Maimonides endorses. Abraham grasped the model of the cosmos that would appear in Aristotelian astronomy that we saw earlier, and he used that model to realize that God exists. Moreover, Maimonides presents Abraham as something who is unafraid to undermine inherited beliefs. Right after grasping that God exists, Maimonides' Abraham had no compunction about challenging deeply held views about religious life in his surroundings, right? He criticized the forms of idolatry he saw around him. Abraham, in other words, rejected precisely the sort of move associated with the anti-intellectualism that Maimonides envisions. Abraham did not recoil from the possibility that philosophy and science might undermine what seemed to be core tenets of religious life. Rather, he embraced philosophy and science, even though those disciplines required rethinking and rejecting the views that had been inherited and affirmed by everyone around him. What we have here is one Maimonidean strategy for defending science and philosophy, re-narrating the Jewish past. Maimonides takes a core moment in Jewish historical consciousness, the story of Abraham, and reinterprets it to defend philosophy. Right, far from being a threat to Jewish belief, philosophy and science in this story have a long history in Judaism. Right, according to Maimonides, it was precisely through astronomical observations and rational reflection that the first Jew, Abraham, came to believe in God. And far from being an acceptable response to the radical implications of philosophy and science, anti-intellectualism in this story is itself a radical break with the Jewish past. It's a break with the behavior modeled by Abraham himself when he rejected idolatry, when he used philosophy and science to rethink everything he had inherited. For Maimonides, then, one way to respond to anti-intellectualism is to re-narrate Jewish history. He recasts the status of philosophy and science in the Jewish past. He claims that philosophy and science have long been part of Jewish life, and he portrays opposition to those disciplines as a deviation from one of Judaism's greatest heroes. And this isn't all. Maimonides doesn't simply re-narrate Jewish history, he also reimagines Jewish practice. Now, I want to be clear, Maimonides was not some sort of proto-reform Jew. Maimonides accepted the binding validity of halakha, of Jewish law, and he followed many of the precedents emerging from rabbinic literature. In at least one case, though, he also reimagined or reconceptualized the content of Jewish law. So the key passage appears in the second chapter of his law code, the second chapter of his Mishnah Torah, which takes up two well-known commandments in the biblical book of Deuteronomy. The commandment to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might, and the commandment to fear the Lord your God. And this is what Maimonides has to say about those commandments in his law code. It's a positive commandment to love God and also to fear him. As the verse states, thou shalt love the Lord thy God, and thou shalt fear the Lord thy God. But how does one learn to love and fear him? Well, when man contemplates God's works and his great and marvelous creatures, he sees from them wisdom that is without estimate or end, and he's immediately filled with love and praise. When a man thinks about these mighty matters, he drawbacks and trembles and realizes that he is a minute creature. So according to Maimonides, the way we fulfill our obligation to love God is to contemplate God's works and his great and marvelous creatures. Since then we'll see that God's wisdom is without estimate or end, and will be filled with love. We'll come to love God when we see all of the amazing things that God has done and realize just how wise God is. Moreover, the way we fulfill our obligation to fear God is by continuing this contemplation, since we'll then realize that we're just minute creatures. We'll have a sort of fear of or reverence for God when we realize just how insignificant we are in comparison to that deity. Now, the question that immediately arises is what this looks like concretely, what it means to contemplate God's works. Maybe this is an obligation to reflect on the works performed by God in the Bible. So the miracles God performed, the liberation of the Israelites from Egypt, the revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai. So this is the question to which Maimonides now turns. In accordance with these sayings, I will explain great principles from the works of the Lord of the universe, so that there may be an opening for one who wants to understand. All that the Blessed One created in the world, he divided into three parts. Some are composite creatures of matter and shape, which exist and pass away, like the bodies of men, animals, plants, and minerals. Some are composite creations of matter and shape, which do not change in shape and form, like the first group. Their form is fixed forever, and their substance is unchanging. They're the planets and stars around them. So having promised to explain the contemplation that's needed to fulfill the commandment to love and fear the deity, Maimonides doesn't turn to divinely enacted miracles or divinely guided events in the Bible. Rather, he offers what sounds like a passage from a science textbook, a classification of different phenomena, people, animals, plants, minerals, planets, and stars, into different categories, bodies that decay over time and bodies that don't decay over time. And that's precisely what this is. This is a concise description of key ideas from Aristotelian science. And this summary of Aristotelian science continues for 2.5 chapters in Maimonides' law code. I'll just offer you one example. He writes in the 3rd chapter in the section of his law code, the celestial spheres are 9. The nearest to us is the moon sphere, and the next one is the sphere of the stars, wherein is Mercury. The 3rd sphere contains Venus, and the 4th above us contains the sun. The 5th sphere has Mars. In the 6th is Judgment, Jupiter. The 7th sphere has Saturn. All of the other stars which we see in the heavens are in the 8th sphere. All these spheres encircle the world like a globe, and the earth hangs in the center. From the journey of the stars and the distance they travel each day and hour, and their movement south and north, and from north to south, and their distance above the earth, from all these, the number of the spheres and their circles are known. This is the science of the spheres and planets, about which the Greeks have written many books. Right? This is a summary of that Aristotelian account of the cosmos that we saw earlier, that system of spheres in which the stars and planets are embedded. And in fact, Maimonides states this explicitly. What he's talking about in his law code, he says, is the science of the spheres and planets, about which the Greeks have written many books. So Maimonides is doing something striking. He isn't just insisting that the way we fulfill our obligation to love and fear God is by exploring God's works. He's insisting that the way we explore God's works is by studying Aristotelian science. He's presenting philosophy and science as a path to fulfilling a Jewish legal requirement. And lest we wonder just how strong of a claim he's presenting, he writes the following later in the Mishnah Torah. No one loves the Holy One, blessed be he, except by the experience of knowing him. This we have explained in the first treatise concerning the foundations of the Torah, the section we just saw about love and fear. According to Maimonides, no one loves God except by the experience of knowing him, in accordance with what was explained in the first treatise concerning the foundations of the Torah, in accordance with the discussion of love, fear, and Aristotelian science outlined earlier. The study of Aristotelian science isn't just one way to fulfill a core requirement of Jewish law, it is the way to fill that requirement. It's the ideal way to meet your obligation to love and fear God. What we have here is a second Maimonidean strategy for defending the place of science and philosophy in Jewish life, reimagining Jewish practice. Maimonides takes a core element of Jewish law, the dual commandments to love and fear God, and he reinterprets it to incorporate philosophy and science into Jewish life. Far from being threats to Jewish belief, philosophy and science become indispensable elements of Jewish practice. Without them, we actually can't love and fear God. And far from being a way to preserve Jewish belief from threats, anti-intellectualism itself represents an abandonment of Judaism. Right? Without these forms of inquiry, on Maimonides' account, we actually fall short of the demands of Deuteronomy 6. If you haven't studied science and philosophy, you've never really loved God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. For Maimonides, then, another way to address anti-intellectualism is to reimagine Jewish practice. He not only recasts the status of philosophy in the Jewish past, he also inserts them directly into Jewish law, into the process of loving and fearing the deity. So there are other strategies Maimonides employs. For now, though, I want to turn to another thinker, a modern Jewish philosopher who also took up the task of wrestling with anti-intellectualism, but who raised concerns about Maimonides' approach to this challenge. So that figure is named Nachman Krochmal. If you've never heard of him, don't worry. He's at once one of the best-known and least studied figures in modern Jewish thought. So he was born in 1785 in a region known as Galicia, what's now Ukraine, and he appears in almost every history of modern Jewish philosophy. So he's remembered as one of the first Jewish figures to wrestle seriously with biblical criticism and with modern European philosophy. He's remembered as the author of a magisterial Hebrew treatise known as the Guide of the Perplexed of the Time, the Moreh Nevuchei, a work that was unfinished when he died in 1840. And he's remembered for his life story. He achieved everything I just outlined without much formal training or any academic position. He taught himself German, French, Latin, Arabic, and Syriac, like most of us, and he worked as a communal official and a very unsuccessful liquor merchant. Nevertheless, despite all this, Krochmal is now rarely studied, at least in North America. Despite scholarship in Israel and Europe, there hasn't been an English language book on him since 1991, and there's no English translation of his guide. So the important point for us is the close connection between Krochmal and Maimonides. So the title of Krochmal's book, The Guide of the Perplexed of the Time, is of course an allusion to Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. Krochmal is being cast here as a kind of modern-day Maimonides. And moreover, if we actually look at Krochmal's text, we find a mode of intellectual inquiry that's very reminiscent of what we saw in Maimonides. So Krochmal calls this kind of intellectual activity the science of faith. And this is how he describes it. In the Torahitic faith, in the hearts of those who adhere to it, there are already representations and feelings regarding the Lord, blessed be he, and similar matters. The activity of the science of faith is simply to cognize the truth of those representations. That is to say, to transform them into universal principles and concepts of the understanding. Thus, ever since our predecessors began to dwell on the roots of religion and the secrets of Torah, new concepts of thought would emerge for them, and they would be forced to define them and signify them with terms such as infinite and finite, necessary and possible existence, and the material and the spiritual. The sages never hesitated to take the aforementioned concepts and terms from other sciences, and in particular from logical philosophy. So according to Krochmal, the science of faith is a mode of inquiry that begins with representations in the Torah-itic faith in the hearts of individuals, but then transform those representations into concepts of the understanding, analyzing those claims and reframing them in terms of ideas borrowed from philosophy, such as infinite and finite, material and spiritual, and necessary and possible existence. Right? Put more simply, this is a mode of inquiry in which we begin with claims in Jewish sources, or with our sort of intuitive judgments and feelings about various matters, and in which we then elevate those claims to a more conceptually rigorous form, in the sense of reflecting on them and recasting them in more theoretically sophisticated terms using tools derived from philosophy. So, for example, I might encounter the biblical claim that God created the cosmos, and I'll reflect on the meaning of that claim. And I'm going to eventually determine that the image of divine creation points to a more subtle philosophical idea, the idea that the material world is real, but rooted in something spiritual, something beyond the physical. So this sounds like that vision we saw Maimonides outline in his guide, that vision of someone studying philosophy and thereby going beyond the straightforward meaning of key terms and concepts to attain a more sophisticated and deeper understanding. Right? This sounds like that vision of someone who draws on the resources of philosophy to generate a more coherent account of God than the one we find in the surface meaning of sources such as the Bible. Maimonides and Krochmal, in other words, share a view of philosophy as an integral part of Jewish life, as a mode of inquiry that allows individuals to come to a deeper, more sophisticated, more coherent understanding of concepts central to the Jewish tradition. These similarities run deeper. Because Krochmal, too, sees this form of inquiry as being at risk from anti-intellectual opposition. After describing the science of faith, this is what Krochmal writes. For an adherent of religion, there's some sort of necessity that leads him to take up the path of the studies and inquiries mentioned above. But behold, this necessity does not appear upon initial reflection. Similarly, most rabbis are accustomed to raise questions regarding speculative science. Who's brought us into all this? Why should he or a believer be brought into modes of inquiry that, as even the person involved admits, are fraught with great perils? Surely it's good for us to accept Torahic beliefs and terms as the masses and as children without stepping even one pace beyond them. Many individuals, Krochmal worries, are unaware of the necessity of the science of faith, of why it might be beneficial to draw on philosophy to generate a more sophisticated, nuanced understanding of Judaism. And in fact, he continues, many individuals are actively hostile to such inquiry, preferring to remain with a simplistic, almost childlike understanding of Torahic beliefs because they view speculative science as a source of great perils, as an endeavor that might upend or go beyond cherished assumptions crucial to the life of a believer. Right? Just as Maimonides worried about a form of anti-intellectualism, so too does Krochmal. Just as Maimonides imagines individuals accusing philosophy of sullying faith, Krochmal imagines individuals criticizing philosophy as being fraught with great perils. So at this point, then, we might expect Krochmal to continue following Maimonides. For example, to sort of adopt the Maimonidean response to anti-intellectualism, to adopt that Maimonidean strategy of re-narrating the Jewish past, of arguing that philosophy has a long history in Judaism. Strikingly, though, instead of following this Maimonidean path, Krochmal singles it out as inadequate. This is what he says in the very next lines of the guide. If we respond that surely we have clear testimonies that for a period of time that at any rate is close to 2,000 years, the number of those engaged in these studies has grown, they'll say, so what? You must acknowledge that from that time to the time of the master Maimonides until this very day, the number of individuals perplexed by these studies has grown and grown. As long as you've not proven the necessity of the matter in itself and its basis in the soul of the believer, do not bring proof from this problem for the sake of resolving it. So Krochmal contemplates engaging in something like the appeal to the past that we saw in Maimonides, right? He contemplates arguing that philosophy has a long history in the Jewish tradition, arguing that for 2,000 years, the number of those engaged in philosophical studies has grown. Rather than tout the success of this approach, though, Krochmal envisions its failure. So what? He imagines his foes responding. What does it matter that philosophy goes back millennia as long as its defenders have not proven its necessity in itself and its basis in the soul of the believer? As long as the role of philosophical inquiry in the life of a faithful adherent of Judaism remains unclear. What does it matter that philosophy is a 2,000-year history in Judaism if that history can be narrated as a story of problems rather than benefits, as a story of how the number of individuals perplexed by philosophy has grown and grown? Krochmal is criticizing the very type of re-narration of the Jewish past that we saw in Maimonides. There might, Krochmal admits elsewhere, be cases that call for this move. He has a lot to say about Jewish history. Appeals to the past, though, will not be effective as long as the necessity of philosophy has not been proven. Such appeals, in other words, have to come after philosophy's value has been established, after some argument has shown philosophy to be crucial to the life of a believer. Otherwise, what such appeals might show is not that philosophy is a legitimate pursuit, but rather that it's long been a problem. Right? So for Krochmal, the factor which Maimonides stresses, philosophy's long history, is not a reliable indication of religious value. Beneficial phenomena can have long histories, but so too can harmful ones. So Krochmal's response then is to adopt a very different approach and to try to establish philosophy's value differently. This is what he writes. It's a long passage, but we'll figure out what's going on. The entire principle of the intellect is its activity of taking the sensible representations and forming concepts. Every human being engages in this activity every day in his thought and speech. If a person asks, "What is this?" and someone responds by answering, for example, house, or saying six-sided figure, then he's already formed from sensible representations this thing that stands before him, universal concepts. House, a term and concept encompassing any place designated for dwelling, or six-sided figure, a concept encompassing in itself the figure as a whole, sixness, length, proportion, and the nature of sides and angles. Representations at the beginning of thought are isolated, each one on its own, lacking any cognitively generated connection, just as is the case with Torahitic representations among the masses. Even among the masses, the understanding's knowledge does not rest until universal and ordered concepts emerge. In truth, the difference between the empty-headed and the wise is merely the difference in the degree of clarity and confusion with respect to concepts and the manner of comprehending them. Nearly all of them engage in this intellectual activity as a matter of course. So again, there's a lot going on here, but essentially Krochmal is advancing three claims. The first is that the type of reflection involved in a kind of philosophically inspired activity like the science of faith, taking representations and forming concepts from them, is also involved in the activities that every human being engages in every day. And in particular, the work of elevating our simple, intuitive impressions and judgments into a more theoretically coherent form, into more theoretically sophisticated ideas, is just what human beings do as a matter of course, right? So consider someone who sees a thing and thinks of it as a house or a six-sided figure. Without necessarily being aware of doing so, that individual has elevated some kind of simple content into a more conceptually rigorous form. They've taken their impressions of a physical object in front of them, they've analyzed those impressions, and they've recast that object as a structure that can be used for dwelling and possesses various geometrical properties. Right. So all that separates the philosophy from the thinking of the masses, therefore, is the degree of clarity with respect to concepts and the matter of comprehending them. Philosophy may involve more precise concepts, but this is a matter of degree rather than kind. Philosophy is just an extension of a type of reflection that goes on in the ordinary activities of any human being. Krochmal's second claim is that this type of reflection involves a philosophically driven activity, or rather, Krochmal's second claim is that the type of reflection involved in a philosophically driven activity, like the science of faith, is not just present in ordinary human activities, rather, it is crucial to such activities. So the reason Krochmal says that the intellect does not rest until universal and ordered concepts emerge is that representations at the beginning of thoughts are isolated, lacking any cognitively generated connection. Right? On this view, our initial sense impressions generate further reflection because they're isolated cognitively, because they don't fit into some more coherent picture of reality that we have in our minds. For example, the reason we apply a concept like house to our impression of some physical thing is because doing so is necessary if we are to function in the world. It's necessary if we incorporate our sense impressions into some broader scheme for making sense of the world. If we're to determine, say, which structures are fit for dwelling and which are fit for other purposes. Right? So philosophy isn't just an extension of an intellectual process present in our ordinary activities. It's an extension of an intellectual process necessary to such activities. It's an extension of an intellectual process that's crucial if we're to experience the world not as a kind of cascade of unintelligible objects without any order, but rather as a constellation of houses and other structures that can be related to one another in a coherent fashion. And Krochmal's third and final point is that this is also the case for Torah-idic representations among the masses, for the content encountered in the Jewish tradition. This content, too, does not immediately fit together into a coherent picture of reality. This content, too, will therefore require conceptual reflection that fundamentally is no different from what goes on in philosophy. More precisely, Krochmal continues, this content will generate problems such that every person, according to his own path and level, embarks upon the conceptual activity outlined above. This is what Krochmal says, and this will be our last passage. Again, it's long, but we'll be able to figure out what it means. One finds in these matters profound questions and opposed statements whose two contradictory components offer a significant point of entry for the soul and intellect. Questions include, are action and intention both essential, or is one essential and one merely beneficial, and which is which? How do atonement by means of Yom Kippur and atonement by means of death work, and how effective are they? Examples of opposed pronouncements include his glory fills the earth, and the attending angels ask, where is the place of his glory? You saw no likeness when the Lord your God spoke to you, and he beholds the likeness of the Lord. The soul that you have placed me in pure, but our will is to perform your will, but what prevents us, the evil inclination. Children will not be put to death for their parents, and they will rot away over the sins of their fathers. Behold, all of these questions and pronouncements, along with countless others that are similar to them and branch out from them, are great and profound investigations, some in theoretical philosophy, some in practical philosophy, some in divine Torah-idic science. So Krochmal moves through diverse practices involved in Jewish life to show that they are riddled with questions and tensions which offer a significant point of entry for the intellect, requiring precisely the kind of conceptual reflection involved in philosophy. Consider Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Individuals who observe this holiday will engage in ritual behavior that's supposed to alter their moral status, reconciling them with God and fellow humans. Individuals will therefore have a reason to take up this idea of a holiday-induced moral transformation, analyze it, and produce a coherent account of how it could take place, lest they find themselves plagued by doubts about how atonement by means of a specific day could possibly prove effective. Another example is prayer. The Sabbath liturgy presents diametrically opposed statements about God's presence, just as the daily liturgy presents human innocence in a manner that contradicts other texts' lament of human sinfulness. Worshippers will therefore have reason to take up these statements, reflect on them, and formulate more sophisticated accounts of God's presence in human nature, lest they conclude that it's impossible to think about these weighty issues in a consistent manner. Yet another example involves reading the Bible. Encountering these texts will confront individuals with wildly contradictory statements about topics such as God's visibility and humanity's guilt across generations. Readers will therefore have reason to take up such claims, reflect on the issues they raise, and produce more rigorous accounts of these topics, lest they find themselves boring that there's no coherent way to think about divinity and morality. For Krochmal, then, the ordinary dynamics of Jewish practice are inextricably linked with conceptual activity associated with philosophy. The activity of taking content, reflecting on it, and elevating it to a more theoretically sophisticated form. Such conceptual activity will be crucial for every person at whatever level because it allows Judaism to make sense, because it addresses questions and worries that arise from ordinary activities such as holidays, prayer, and biblical study. Right? Philosophy is just an especially rigorous form of that ordinary activity. So close is this relationship, in fact, that Krochmal suggests that the concerns which arise out of the ordinary activities of Jewish life are themselves great and profound investigations in philosophy. Philosophy isn't separate from the reasoning that arises from Jewish practice. It's just a sophisticated version of that reasoning. But differently, philosophy is valuable because it's an extension of reflection necessary to the ordinary operations of Jewish practice. Philosophy is simply a more rigorous form of a conceptual process that's crucial if adherents are to experience Judaism not as a series of activities that yield irresolvable questions and contradictions, but as a constellation of practices that give rise to a coherent way of viewing reality. Krochmal is thus responding to anti-intellectualism by linking philosophy to Jewish practice. Far from being a threat to Jewish belief, philosophy is an indispensable supplement to Jewish practice. Jewish life risks being experienced as an incoherent mix of contradictions unless we engage in serious conceptual reflection. And far from being a way to avoid perils, anti-intellectualism is itself the real threat. If we reject philosophy, we're rejecting the type of activity that allows us to rise above the contradictions that loom large in the ordinary activities of Jewish life. So there are echoes of Maimonides here, right? Both Maimonides and Krochmal present philosophy as necessary to Jewish practice. For Maimonides, philosophy is necessary if we want to fulfill our obligations to love and fear God. For Krochmal, philosophy is necessary if we want everything from the holidays to prayer to the Bible to make any sense. But there are significant differences as well. Maimonides is advocating what we might call a top-down approach to defending philosophy, an approach that involves imposing a new interpretation on an existing element of Jewish practice. For Maimonides, however we might have understood the commandment to love and fear God up to this point, it should now be understood as a requirement to engage in the study of Aristotelian science and philosophy. By contrast, Krochmal is advocating what we might call a bottom-up approach. He accepts Jewish practice as he finds it. He accepts that Jewish practice involves what his contemporaries think it involves: holidays, prayers, reading the Torah. He suggests, however, that it's precisely this widely accepted understanding of Jewish practice that generates the need for philosophy. If we enact Jewish practice as we've always enacted it, there's going to be a looming threat of contradiction, incoherence, and absurdity hanging over much of what we do. And this is a threat that we can dissipate if we draw on philosophy. Put differently, while Maimonides resists anti-intellectualism by reinterpreting what Jewish practice involves, Krochmal resists anti-intellectualism by accepting what Jewish practice involves. Maimonides resists anti-intellectualism by reimagining the ordinary dynamics of Jewish life. Krochmal resists it by immersing himself in the ordinary dynamics of Jewish life. For Maimonides, Jewish life can be reconfigured to support philosophy. For Krochmal, Jewish practice already sets the stage for philosophy. Krochmal thus offers a different vision for what it means to resist anti-intellectualism. He's skeptical that re-narrating the Jewish past will accomplish much in the face of virulent opposition, and he instead seeks to show how Jewish practice, as it now stands, organically creates a need and space for philosophical reflection. If we had more time, there's much more that we could say, but I want to leave at least a few minutes for questions. But I think what we're left with today is two very different visions of what it means to resist anti-intellectualism. For Maimonides, resisting anti-intellectualism involves remaking the past and present in our image, finding cases of science and philosophy in the past, and rethinking the practices of the present to create room for them. By contrast, for Krochmal, resisting anti-intellectualism isn't about remaking the past and present in our image. It's about taking the past and present seriously. It's about immersing ourselves in the concerns of the communities we want to shape and showing that those concerns themselves have room for, can be addressed more effectively by philosophy. If Maimonides calls for something daring, Krochmal calls for something humble. If Maimonides calls for us to impose our understanding of intellectual activity on the world, Krochmal calls on us to kind of impose the world's concerns on ourselves and show how philosophy arises from them. I don't know which of these approaches makes more sense, but I hope that all of us will find space to experiment with them as we try to find ways to address the the anti-intellectualism we see in the world around us, and find ways to recover space for the intellectual inquiry that both of these figures found so important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sacks. It was a great presentation. It's always so fascinating to learn with you. We would love to open it up to questions. If anyone would like to make a comment or ask a question, please feel free to raise your hands and we can call on people to unmute. And you can also write things in the chat as well. Hi, Michael.
Elias, first, let's thank you for choosing this very challenging question. And your references on Nachman Krochmal is really eye-opening. Let me start. I do want to make a comment, but let me ask a couple questions. One is probably quite straightforward. When Nachman Krochmal referred to six-sided figure, that is concept of wholeness of what he meant really. What's your understanding? Because we don't have access to this text.
Yeah. So first, I just want to acknowledge what you said about these being difficult texts. This is hard material that we looked at today, and I'm really grateful to all of you. Krochmal actually means something I think much more simple there. He's saying sometimes when I see a kind of structure in front of me, I'm going to think of it as a house, or I'm going to think of it as essentially a cube, something with six sides. And Krochmal says, when I'm doing that, I'm engaged in something like philosophy. What I'm doing is I'm taking just some very basic judgment I have. There's a thing in front of me, and I'm reassessing it in terms of some broader concept. I'm reassessing it as a house, as a space that can be used for dwelling. I'm reassessing it as a six-sided figure, as a figure that has six sides and therefore possesses various geometric properties. Krochmal is actually sort of just saying that our basic judgments about the world, when we see things as houses or as cubes, that's a kind of proto-philosophical activity. That's taking a simplistic understanding of the world and reassessing it in terms of concepts and categories.
I see. Elias, can you recommend any literature to learn more about Krochmal's literature?
Yeah, so there's relatively there's not so much literature on Krochmal. The most recent book in English is a book in 1991 by the scholar Jay Harris. That's the last book-length treatment. The most prolific Israeli scholar of Krochmal is a figure named Yehoyada Amir, just recently retired from Hebrew University. He has some wonderful articles. I can share them with Alex and they can get sent out. I've written a little bit about Krochmal as well, but let me direct you to the writings of others rather than to the writings by me.
Thank you very much. If you have time for a comment, why it's important? Because when you talk about drop of belief in society for science, we need to separate what we understand under science. It's activity to gain knowledge, or we're talking about modern science that was formed during last, let's say, 300 years, where it should be based on experimental studies. And we have real crisis, especially after creation of quantum physics, where really we cannot choose is it particle or wave. And here is why Krochmal's logic it's going beyond Aristotelian logic, which is Maimonides really followed Aristotelian logic, which is basically one of the principles excluded third, yes or no, black and white. And it's not enough for modern science. So it's why it's so important.
And I'll just say on that topic, one of the questions that occupies many Jewish thinkers in the 18th and 19th century is how to think about philosophy in a world where Aristotelian science is no longer valid. Much of medieval Jewish philosophy sort of assumes an Aristotelian understanding of the world, and many modern Jewish thinkers, Mendelssohn, Krochmal, and others, are trying to sort of reimagine the world without Aristotelianism. I do just want to flag that Maimonides himself could at least contemplate that possibility. Maimonides was an Aristotelian in many ways, a Platonist in other ways, but he also recognized that there were real flaws in Aristotelian thought and imagined that if there were to be kind of rejections of key Aristotelian ideas, that wouldn't be fatal. We could just engage in a new process of reinterpreting Jewish life in light of whatever turns out to be the best scientific framework available. There's a kind of intuitive or beginnings of a sense of a kind of history of science already at work in medieval Jewish philosophy and then accelerated in modern Jewish philosophy.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Dr. Sacks. It's always a pleasure to have you at VBM, and thank you to Temple Emmanuel for co-sponsoring. Our next program will be next week on Thursday evening, The Madwoman in the Rabbi's Attic, rereading The Women of the Talmud with Gila Fine. That'll be in person in Phoenix, if anyone is in the area, at the New Shul at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. And we'll also have the Zoom option as well for those of you who aren't. So hope you can join us for that or one of our other upcoming events. Thank you all so much for joining today.